If you've listened to Brewlosophy at all, you know how much we love Imperial Yeast. The company was founded on the ideal that if you're going to do something, do it right. From their Imperial Pitch-Right pouches, packing a whopping 200 billion cells of healthy and viable yeast in each pouch, to their commitment to commercial customers, guaranteeing 10 of their most popular strains are in stock for orders up to 20 liters, or the shipping is free, Imperial Yeast does it right. No more worrying about whether you need to make a starter or propagate your yeast prior to pitching. Imperial Yeast makes it easy for the home brewer and commercial brewer to obtain direct pitches at proper rates when you need it. To place a commercial order or to get more information about everything that Imperial Yeast has to offer, head on over to imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. If you're a fan of lambics, gozes, and American farmhouse sours, then you're probably a fan of the unique funkiness that's imparted by a genus of yeast known as Brettanomyces. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today in the lab I'm speaking with Dr. Katherine Thompson-Witrick. She's an assistant professor at the University of Florida, and we're going to talk about how water chemistry, specifically how bicarbonates, impact the efficacy of Brettanomyces to do what we want it to do in beer, that is ferment or make alcohol, and produce all those funky aromatic flavors that we like hay, clove, earthy, mushroom, barnyard, horse blanket. Those flavors that add all of that character to the Belgian spontaneous styles I mentioned at the top of the show. And a good lambic or goose, I don't know exactly how to say it. Hopefully that's good enough. Any Belgians that are listening, write in with feedback. But a goose is going to have some interesting Brett character. And as a part of some ongoing research into beer made with Brettanomyces, Katherine and her research team looked at how bicarbonates impact fermentation performance, but also those aromatic compounds that are produced. The presence of bicarbonates, especially in high concentrations, can have an inhibitory effect on Saccharomyces cerevisiae, normal brewing yeast, but there isn't much research on how it impacts Brettanomyces. We know that water chemistry is important to yeast, but how important is it to Brettanomyces? And that's the question we'll be discussing today. If you haven't yet visited patreon.com/brewlosophy, please check it out. Patreon is one of the coolest ways for you to support the work we do here because of the unique rewards, discounts at Yakima Valley Hops, a monthly live Q&A session, and all the other fun stuff that's listed over on patreon.com/brewlosophy. If you're following all the content we produce here, you know it's a lot. It's an experiment and a secondary series article every week, 2 Hop Chronicles article, a Brew It Yourself, Short and Shoddy, 2 podcasts. There's just a lot going on. And your support through Patreon helps keep all of this going. So if you haven't already, please consider becoming a patron by visiting patreon.com/brewlosophy. And also this time of the year, it's holiday season. Black Friday is just around the corner, and it's an easy way for you to support us by starting your online shopping experience using the links listed at brewlosophy.com/support. Just click those links and continue your shopping as usual. It's an easy way to support us, and it doesn't impact your shopping experience at all. Check out all of our affiliates and find the links at brewlosophy.com/support. And feedback this week is brought to you by the folks from John I. Haas, who over the last couple years have released a handful of really cool hop products like Lupamax, Incognito, and Flex, all intended to improve beer while reducing vegetal matter and thus increasing yields. Well, they're excited to announce their latest 100% hop-derived product, especially made for your patio, lawnmower, or beach beers, Kettle Ready. Imparts a smooth, light, stable bitterness and kettle hop aroma to beer while offering microbiological protection during the brewing process. This new product is easy to use, has no special dosing requirements, and plus, due to its standardized high alpha acid concentration in a light, stable molecule, it gives the light stability and bitterness characteristics desired for all traditional beers. And it plays well with other Haas products, including Tetra Hop Gold, Hexa Hop Gold, and Ready Hop. For flexibility and optionality when brewing light, stable beers, learn more about Kettle Ready at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. All right, listener Matt wrote in from England about episode 85 of thiols, how GMO yeasts can be used to increase thiol character with Ricky Molitor. And he says, "Hi, Cade, love listening to your podcast, and I'm trying to get my head around episode 85 when you're talking about thiol-enhancing yeast. We can't get that exact strain here in England as it's GMO, but we have something similar, White Labs WLP 077, which claims to do the same thing. In your podcast, you both said that you preferred the beer made with the boil and whirl Whirlpool hop additions. Can you tell me what hops were used and in what quantity? I guess different hops will contribute different aromas and different amounts of aroma. So would like to brew with the same hops that you used, and I'll let you know how it turns out. Thanks a lot, Matt. Hey, Matt. Yeah, awesome. Thanks for writing in and listening over in England. The hops were all Cascade, and so they're Cascade for a very important purpose. Cascade has a high concentration of bound thiol precursors, especially when compared to other varieties like Mosaic and Sabro. And yes, you are absolutely right that different hops will contribute different aromas and intensities because they have different levels of free and bound thiols. So Cascade, again, has a low concentration of free thiols and a high concentration of bound thiols. But compare that with Sabro, which is exactly the opposite. It has high concentration of free thiols and a low concentration of bound thiols. So that might be some of that tropical fruitiness that we're all getting from Sabro is free thiol related. The genetically engineered or genetically modified yeast that was used in Ricky's study acts to liberate bound thiols. So hops like Cascade work better with this yeast. And in terms of, the White Labs WLP 077, I haven't ever brewed with it, but if it's supposed to liberate bound thiols, then yeah, maybe that can work for you. And again, the hops were all Cascade, so that's an easy one to repeat. And the quantities are as follows. So all of the beers in Ricky's study got 1.5 grams per liter in the boil. All right. That's just a 60-minute addition, 1.5 grams per liter. The Whirlpool beers then got 3 grams per liter in the Whirlpool, and the single dry hopped beer, that was the one that was using, I think just Chico strain. I can't remember exactly which strain it was, but that was the one that was just the regular brewing yeast strain, got 10 grams per liter of dry hop. So again, a 1.5 gram per liter, 60-minute addition in the boil, a Whirlpool addition at 3 grams per liter, and or a 10 grams per liter dry hop addition. So the beer that Ricky and I like got 1.5 grams in the boil and 3 grams at the Whirlpool, and that was with the GMO yeast. And I just want to say that while Ricky and I preferred the GMO beer with the kettle and Whirlpool additions as compared to the other beers in the study, I think it could also benefit from a small dry hopping charge, something like 3 grams per liter or something. I mean, I haven't ever brewed a beer with GMO yeast and all 3 hop additions. The only experience I've had with this particular GMO yeast is just the boil and Whirlpool additions, but I think you might be able to get a little something extra, a little bit more, I'm going to put air podcast quotes, hoppy character, like that resinous or hop aroma character. If you're just thinking like, I want hop aroma, maybe a little bit of that would also round out some of those hoppy notes. But yeah, so my recommendation would be do 1.5 grams in the boil, 3 grams at Whirlpool, and then something like another 3 grams as a dry hopping charge. But again, I've never brewed that beer. I just think it might turn out well. But if you want to repeat Ricky's study, the beer that we liked, it's just the boil and the Whirlpool additions, 1.5 grams in the boil, 3 grams in the Whirlpool. So thanks, Matt, for writing in with that question. I'm going to take a quick break, and then I'll be back with Dr. Katherine Thompson-Witrick talking about the impact of bicarbonates on Brettanomyces.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
There's been a lot of research looking at how different minerals in water impact brewer's yeast and the final flavor profile of beer. Cations like calcium, magnesium, and sodium, and anions like chloride, sulfates, and bicarbonates are important because they impact fermentations with Saccharomyces cerevisiae. But there's limited research looking into how these ions impact Brettanomyces. So here with me in the lab to answer some of these questions is Dr. Katherine Thompson-Witrick. Katherine, welcome to the Brew Lab.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so this is surprisingly the 87th episode of the show and the first true episode on Brettanomyces, which is kind of shocking to me. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously a yeast that's used a lot in beer. And Catherine, are you a fan of Brett beers?
Oh yeah. I mean, my entire PhD was on lambic, so I would think that would be a yes.
Yeah, that's definitely a yes. And I love a good lambic and a sour Brett beer. The Brett beer, I don't know. We'll see. I have my own opinions about Brett beer, but I can certainly understand where people like them. And like you said, you did your PhD on lambics. You got your PhD in food science and technology from the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. And you're now an assistant professor at the University of Florida. So I asked this question of all of my guests, especially the first time they're on the show. What do you do, or what made you want to do brewing science research?
I was really more interested in, so there's a lot of people who go into wine. That's nothing, I love wine research, love me a good glass of wine, but there's limited research, particularly on the East Coast in brewing. And I really wanted to go more into brewing than I did wine, because also brewing research takes a little less time.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, we're not so restricted to harvesting, particularly with wine. Like if you are with brewing, we can set up our experiments. Sounds really bad. We can collect our data within a matter of weeks. This project took a little over a year, but for the most part, it takes about a couple weeks to gain data. And like I said, we're not restricted on a harvest timeline that we would be with wine if we're doing anything out in the field. Plus, I don't know, I was just more interested in doing something different because there's a lot of wine.
Right. Well, and it's okay to say it too. This is a beer safe space. Beer's better, right? Oh no, you can't.
There's a time and place for every fermented product.
I say that all the time. That's true.
I promise you, there are days when I go home and I'm like, that glass of wine hits that spot, or you go home and that martini hits that spot. It depends upon what day you've had.
That's exactly right. I say that all the time. Every fermented beverage has its special occasion, right? Has its occasion where it's time to shine. And I do too. I like wine, and I like mixed drinks, and I like beer. But beer is definitely my favorite. But I totally understand where people have differences of opinion there. But so let's talk about Brettanomyces, and let's talk about your study specifically, what we're going to talk about today. So you wanted to understand how bicarbonates impact Brettanomyces. So tell me, maybe just like a little bit, like a teaser, an abstract of like what's the deal here? What are you trying to get at with bicarbonate and Brettanomyces?
Well, first of all, you should never ask me to do an abstract. That's why I have grad students write that.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Fair enough, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, really the idea was Brettanomyces is not so much the new kid on the block, but it's the new research strain on the block. And the idea was we wanted to see how water actually impacted the fermentation kinetics. That was kind of the big idea that we wanted to do. And I have to kind of shout out to Eric, who kind of was, he was actually he kind of came up with the idea and helped me kind of flesh it out a little bit. Because we knew a lot about water impacting, kind of that extractability, particularly with, your grains. If you think about it, if the water is, if the pH is off, you're not going to get a great extraction for some of the things. You may bring out too many of the tannins, etc. But no one had looked at, again, we knew what happens if your bicarbonates are too high, particularly for sac, you'll get a stuck fermentation or no fermentation activity at all. But when we were looking at it with the idea of that Brettanomyces is starting to be utilized a lot, no one had really looked at, well, what happens if I manipulate the bicarbonates or the water chemistry? How is that going to impact the fermentation kinetics?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like we said, I mean, like I said at the top of the show, there's just not a lot of research out there on Brettanomyces, which is a fun strain to brew with, right? I mean, I think it's interesting to think it's probably been around just as long as Saccharomyces cerevisiae. I mean, it's certainly in lambics and gozes and all of that, and those have been around for hundreds of years, right? The very, very traditional Belgian brewing processes have Brettanomyces, and heck, the name Brettanomyces means British fungus. So, it's at some point, somewhere, somebody named this yeast after its use, likely in beer, is where it was first discovered. So it's been around for a while, but like you mentioned, there's really not a lot of research, especially on bicarbonates and how they impact fermentation. So we'll get there in a minute, but I think we got to start the top of the show by talking about water, right? And I'll ask this question sort of tongue in cheek because I know the answer, and I think most people listening to the podcast do. But is all water the same?
No, you should know. Yeah, no. I mean, think about it. Like, there are strains specific based on the water from the region. I mean, Burton-on-Trent, Czech Pilsners. I mean, come on. Like, we know that the water impacted those styles and influenced those styles. I mean, we make beautiful lagers in parts of Europe because of the water chemistry.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, even nowadays, you're certainly not going to drink if you taste the water from Florida, because gosh, no, we have a lot of bicarbonates in our water, and you taste it from somewhere out out where you are, they're going to taste differently. And that's going to impact, it's going to impact it from start to finish, not just the yeast, but it's going to impact your extractability of the compounds from your malt. Potentially, if you have a high enough bicarbonates, it's going to impact, your cleaning solutions. I mean, the water itself is used so much in brewing that even these small changes is going to impact the overall bigger picture, I guess.
Yeah. And I think about too, whenever I learned to brew, I was reading books, so like John Palmer's How to Brew and Charlie Papazian's Joy of Homebrewing. And there was a quote from Charlie Papazian that said, if you have drinkable water, you can make good beer. And that's great. And that's true, right? Like, you can make good beer, but there needs to be a but, right? But water is going to impact your beer, right? So I think that's the piece that sometimes gets lost. And it's so interesting to me too, and you made this comment in the paper as well, that water always seems like an afterthought of beer and brewing. I mean, a lot of breweries are really just filtering their water and then adding brewing salts to it. But there's a lot of research about why and what those brewing salts would do. So I wanted to sort of talk, maybe a little bit about that. Like, what are brewing salts and what do they do for beer?
I mean, oftentimes, okay, so let's go back to what water is. It's hydrogen and two oxygen.
Yeah, H2O.
Hydrogen and oxygen. Sorry, yeah. I'm like, I didn't know I was going to teach food chem today. I promise I know my chemistry better than it appears.
Yeah, no, that's all right. She is actually a food chemistry professor, but that's your course that you teach, right?
That's one of them. I also teach industrial fermentation.
Ah, cool. Yeah, exactly. So she knows what she's talking about. All right, so brewing salts or water.
In theory, I do. Yeah. In theory, I do.
Right,
I tell people all the time. Like my students sometimes question it. And they question my intelligence. I'm like, all right.
Well, it's okay. Yeah, so water itself, I mean, of course, that's right. It's interesting too, because I think what tripped you up there is sometimes the way that I think about water now. Everybody thinks H2O, right? But I always think of it as a hydrogen and a hydroxyl, HOH now. And that's just because of organic chemistry and how water actually reacts. But that's way off into the weeds, and we don't need to get that far.
Yes.
But yeah. So tell me then. So water and brewing salts.
So water, without all the additional things, in its purest form, it has a neutral pH. So pH is 7. But we know from brewing that we really need to manipulate it and maybe drop that pH. Generally we think of adding salts to maybe drop it to make it maybe slightly more acidic. Or in the case of bicarbonates, we're going to make it a little bit more alkalinic or more basic. So we're kind of manipulating it again we're really ultimately adjusting that pH is more or less what we're doing. And again, by adjusting that pH, we're going to impact the extraction process. Because again, water is a universal solvent that's usually drilled into us as a chemist. Day one, I usually tell my students that all the time. I go, it's a universal solvent. As much as you want to not think about that, it is. And we use it, again, as a extraction or a solvent to extract the compounds from the malt, in this case, and what we were trying to do, but we also used it to activate the enzymes.
Yeah.
It's also heat transfer.
Right. Calcium is one of the big ones, right? For activating enzymes. I mean, you need that in order to help convert starch to sugar during the mashing process. So you've got these different, aspects. So when we think of water, we think of H2O, but there's more in there. There's these little tiny trace, not necessarily trace, but in the parts per million range, or milligrams per liter range of calcium, magnesium, sodium, chloride, sulfate, and bicarbonate. And like you said, the primary thing that brewers are doing is trying to increase that extraction, that sugar resulting from the mashing process. But these ions actually play different roles too, right? They impact flavor, and they impact the way that yeast, interacts during fermentation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, so depending on, again, with the bicarbonates, so with Saccharomyces, they are fine-tuned little instruments. They have an optimum, like enzymes, jokingly, like enzymes, they have an optimum, not only pH range, temperature range, they have this range that they can operate in because they've been so domesticated. Like we know they're domesticated, but with Brett is still a wild strain. It's not, while we have domesticated it in the form that there are strains of commercially available that may be more not as heat tolerant as its wild cousin, or I'd say cousin in a sense. So they are more easily, you could kill them a little bit more easily through your cleaning cycle, versus Brett has a much wider range at which they can operate in. So if it is outside of optimum tolerances, they're still going to function, and they have a better, so they're not going to, they won't, like osmotic stressors that may be associated with something that may be a little outside of their optimum range, like maybe too high, which would cause, again, stressors on SAC. SAC is ultimately going to be like, all right, this, this environment's subpar, it's too much stress, I'm done. And they stop. Well, long story short, they can handle better stressors.
Yeah, maybe like Brettanomyces has a little bit better survivability, right? Because, because yeast has been babied a little bit, right? It's been like nurtured and nursed. It's been like given this sugary solution, and over 1,000 years of brewing, it's optimized itself for this purpose, right? For fermentation of alcoholic beverages. I'm not going to say it's obviously not limited to beer, but I'm using beer as the example.
It's the best example. That's what we're talking about here.
Right, exactly. That's what we're talking about here. But Brettanomyces, like you mentioned, is still kind of like, it's still wild, right? I mean, it's called British fungus because it was creating this smell or this flavor that people identified as, at the time, probably unique to British beers. So it was some wild thing that was causing British character of beers, or at least that's my understanding. If that's not right, send me a feedback and I'll read it on the show. But
they call it, it was first isolated. This is really bad that I can't even remember.
But that's all right. I'm sure somebody will know and that's listening to it and can write in, and then I'll throw it in feedback at the front of an episode. But in any event, right? Like you said, so Brettanomyces has had to exist out in the wild, so it's got a whole bunch of different features that improve its survivability. And now you're a chemist and a flavor a chemist and analytical and sensory and looking at those things. So we're not going to get into the microbiology of it a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, maybe I'll get a microbiologist on the show in the future. But suffice to say that Brettanomyces has these other pathways that they can use to survive in hostile environments. And so a question is, all right, we know that if bicarbonates are high in beer, that Saccharomyces can struggle, but how does Brettanomyces react in that environment? Is that a fair way to say, like, what the research was looking at?
The research was really, so like I said, if you're looking at the paper, when we plotted the fermentation curve. Yes, there are differences in the curve. We're actually, I'm working with Andrew right now. He's a modeler. He does some modeling. So we're trying to actually post, or we'll write paper 2 of this. And then I have a third paper that I'm working on that I hope to write, where, we saw difference in the fermentation kinetics. So that the slope of the curve is actually changing with the increase in bicarbonates.
Okay.
So it actually does impact the yeast's ability to go through its metabolic processes and ferment. It slowed it down significantly.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do look out, most of the work that you have to kind of correlate with is wine research, because that's a lot of where the research has been done on Brett, is because it's such a bad spoilage or they view it as this horrible spoilage microorganism, which is understandable due to the off-flavor development. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we're having to go, is kind of see what research is out there in wine. How can we correlate or bring it into brewing?
Yeah.
More or less.
Yeah, for sure. I understand that. And it is in wine. It's such a spoiler. But looking at bicarbonates, I always, whenever I think about bicarbonates, I always think about like alkalinity, and what's the relationship then to like bicarbonates and alkalinity, and how does that impact beer?
I mean, again, that we know, it's affecting the pH, which we know is going to impact the big part, for our research, because we didn't want the extraction to be messed up. So we didn't want, like, as you added in the bicarbonates, our biggest concern was we knew we were never going to add it in to the mash. Because again, we are trying to hit our specific gravity to make sure that we are brewing a consistent product. So that's the big thing, is if you're manipulating it too soon, or you're manipulating it in your water chemistry, you're going to, again, maybe pull out more of the tannins, or you're not, in most cases with the alkalinity, you're not going to be pulling out enough compounds that would be useful for the fermentation. I know I feel like I'm missing all my words here.
No, you're doing great. You're doing great. No, I think I certainly understand. I think the point is your study is not to look at how bicarbonates impact the mash, right?
Right.
And how it changes sugar extraction.
Because we know that stuff already. That stuff's been done.
Yeah.
And again, that wasn't the purpose, because I don't have a malt background. There are those who are better equipped at looking at malts, at least malt in the sense of like the mashing step, the enzymatic reactions that are occurring. Again, our thing is, I want to know, because again, I make bad beer for a living.
Yeah.
I'm very consistent at bad beer. Okay, that sounds really bad. We make experimental beer, and you and I both know that it's bad beer.
Yeah, exactly. And so, this is going to be an interesting segue too, because I did want to talk about like specific things to Brettanomyces. Not that Brettanomyces is bad beer, because I think it's not. But Brettanomyces definitely offers some things that Saccharomyces doesn't. And I think it's important that we spend some time talking about that before we get into the break and then get into the results of your research. So what does Brettanomyces offer to beer that Saccharomyces doesn't?
So it is. The thing about Brett is, it's the big thing that most people are familiar with is, one is the flavor composition. It has the ability to produce a number of phenolic compounds. Most people think of 4-EP, so 4-ethylene phenol, or 4-ethylene glycol. We also see 4-EG or 4-BG, and then
4-vinyl phenol. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because most of our research, we didn't see the VG and the VP. We found EP and EG, so the ethylene phenol and ethylene glycol. So those were the ones that we knew we were specifically looking for to make sure. Mm-hmm. But those are off flavors in most beer. It's off flavors in wine and everything, because when produced in high enough concentrations, it can smell like, and I know when people say this, it smells disgusting. It does get the spicy note, the clove, the etc. But you also get Barnyard, Band-Aid. Though when you say those, people are like, you take that somewhere else.
Yeah, horse blanket. That's another fun one, right? Yeah, it smells like a horse. I remember I told my wife that the first time, and she said, "Why would you want to drink a beer that tastes like a horse blanket?" And I was like, "I don't know. It tastes good. It's fine. It's kind of earthy, mushroomy. It's okay, right?"
Yeah. And that's kind of the thing, is it provides these, as you said, earthy notes that we otherwise, like, you can get those notes in wine, and I hate comparing it to wine, but because of the grapes themselves provide some of that note to it. But with beer, the malt, unless you're using specialty malts, we're not so much going to get some of those unique aromatics from the malt. We're going to get our aromatics more so from the yeast and from our hops.
Yeah, and those aromatic parts, those things are really important, right? The aromatic compounds. I mean, yeast or Saccharomyces cerevisiae produces those, and Brettanomyces produces those. One real quick short, I think we can. You say this is a short answer. Is does Brettanomyces ferment? Does that actually turn sugar into alcohol and CO2? I think the answer to that's yes.
Yes, we had CO2 product. Because again, in our experiment, we only used Brettanomyces as the fermenting yeast. There was no sac used at all.
Yeah.
Because we wanted to strictly focus 100% on that. And I actually do quite a bit of research where we're doing 100% Brett beers.
Yeah.
You do get ethanol production. You do get the drop-in pH. I mean, you get everything you do with sac. The traditional issue is this is a slower fermenter.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for our study so we did a 10-gallon batch, and I understand I'm jumping ahead, and that's I apologize. Okay. So I can hold off on that if you'd like.
We can get there. I have a couple of other questions real quick, and one of them is so the fermentation. It sounds like what you're looking at, what you're interested here, is a couple of different things, right? One is how is the fermentation activity impacted by bicarbonates, right? That's one issue. But then there's a second half of this, which is how is the flavor of Brett impacted? So Brett, like you just mentioned, is doing a couple of things differently than Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's a slower fermenter already, right? So if we add or if we have bicarbonates in the water, at a higher level, then is that fermentation time or performance being impacted, which is an interesting question. And then how are the flavors, right? Because Brett also, the reason why we ferment with Brett in beer is to add these barnyard, horse blanket, flavors to beer that give it this earthy, mushroomy character, especially when combined with some organic acids like in a lambic or goza. It creates this really nice floral bouquet of a beer that actually can taste really good. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask sort of before we get into like the study itself and get into the break is what's sort of the theory here? Like how would these characteristics be impacted by bicarbonates? What's the thought process there before we get into the actual results?
So we looked at other papers, we've read the books. It all implicated that based on sac, you saw that the sac it was a stressor that the yeast were not ready for or couldn't handle. And we saw reduced in flavor composition. We saw reduced in the fermentation. So either it started off even slower, they didn't go to completion. It was an inhibitory factor. So they weren't able, again, to ferment it completely. So, I mean, again, with Brett or with sac, we're usually trying to get down to 1, right? Or it depends. It depends on where you're going. Brett's a super attenuator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's going to go well below that 1. It can have the ability, if allowed, to go below that 1. We didn't allow it to go. We made sure, like I said, generally, brewers, depending on what style you're going to. So if you want a super dry beer, I mean, you're going to let Brett go to completion. Mm-hmm. But if you want to leave it, most beers will have some sugar left over to, again, kind of create that balance between your hops, which could be super bitter, the ethanol. I mean, there's usually some sugar left over in your beer, at least with sac, again, to create a nice balance while Brett's going to eat whatever it can.
Yeah, it's going to eat a lot of those other sugars, right? It has a higher survivability. So it's able to consume or to excrete an enzyme to be able to break down some of those longer chain sugars, which again, that's why we see as brewers, I mean, most people who are using Brett are pitching Brett after a Saccharomyces fermentation, or, have Brett in a barrel that's just been, sort of living in a barrel, and it continues that fermentation even after Saccharomyces is long gone, right? Or it's finished its fermentation and it's out. So that is a cool impact of Brett. So I can see the question here, right? The question is, okay, we've got Brett yeast, which generally has a different survivability characteristics. Let's look and see how bicarbonate impacts that. And that's ultimately exactly what you did. I mean, I'll just briefly sort of spit out the outline of the study, and then we'll go into the break. But so you brewed beers with different bicarbonate concentrations, and the bicarbonate was added to the boil, and I'll ask you about that in a second, why we added it to the boil. And then you pitched Brettanomyces bruxellensis yeast, monitored fermentation, analyzed the secondary metabolites by GCMS, and reported your results. Is that a fair brief outline? We're going to get into the details. Don't worry.
Yeah, that's basically what we did.
Okay. And it all sounds so like simple and easy when you put it in like a 1-minute spiel. But there's a lot that goes into it and a lot of decisions that had to be made to make sure that they were actually looking at the right characteristics of Brett. And so we'll talk about that right after this break. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Fermtank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. Brettanomyces is featured in several beer styles like Belgian lambics and gozes, traditional American sours, and farmhouse beers, largely because of the phenolic characteristics that it contributes to beer. So barnyard and horse blanket or mushroomy aren't necessarily flavors that most people think of when they think good beer, but they actually, when they're well made, make beers that are full of flavor and aroma. And it sounds like you actually enjoy a nice lambic or a nice goze or an American sour, right, Catherine?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, we again, like we talked about in the first segment, barnyard and horse blanket don't exactly sound like, things that people would want to consume. But again, I think when there's definitely a place for them. Some people love those flavors. And I like them, especially in like a sour beer with some organic acids mixed in. It's like some lactic, not really much acetic, but like some lactic acid and some nice, subtle Brett character. I think those beers are really crushable and they taste really good. They've just got so much flavor as you go through them.
I think the worst part is when we describe Brett, because we're describing just the singular compounds. We're talking about them by themselves.
Yeah.
But unless you're sitting here doing GCO work, which not something I recommend often, it's a lot of work.
Right.
You're not sitting here and smelling beer like individual compounds.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like, that's the thing. Beer, like all other sensory things, it's a combination. So compounds are working in either synergistically, antagonistically, or just, hey, we're here to hang out.
Right.
They all interact in multiple different ways. So that actual barnyard may be transferred or transformed into something else, where just a subtle hint that may go from barnyard to horse blanket to, like you said, earthy, which we don't really think about when we talk about it to people, because we're like, hey, we're going to just talk about the compounds individually. Like, again, with ethyl acetate, you're like, hey, what's ethyl acetate? Because no one asked about like, it's fruity.
Right.
What do you want?
Generically fruity. Yeah.
It can be solventy if you get it high enough concentrations.
Yeah.
But again, everyone's like, I don't want solvent. I'm like, it's all about the concentration found in the product.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's important for Brettanomyces, right? Is understanding these what we refer to as VOCs, volatile organic compounds. So it's important to understand, how these compounds come around, what their impact is and what their concentration is in beer. And again, for your paper, what you were looking at is how bicarbonates influence Brettanomyces, and that's in a couple of different ways: the fermentation performance, but also in the volatile organic compounds and what those concentrations were. So let's kind of walk through the methods, and we'll start, I guess, by talking about the wort preparation. So that was consistent across all of the treatments, but I wanted to go through sort of what beer were you making?
We call that experimental beer.
Yeah, right.
For those of us in brewing, no, it's because I don't know. My father-in-law asked me time, you make good beer? All I hear is bad beer. I'm like, that's my job.
Yeah. My beer is not trying to make it the best tasting beers. To try to make it a blank canvas where I can run my experiment.
It's not gold ward winning.
Right.
We're not submitting it to GABF.
Well, but it's drinkable though. I mean, the beer's drinkable. But yeah, I mean, she's talking about with research beer, and you'll see this a lot. It's that 20 to 25 IBU, 10 Plato wort, 100% pale malt, or sometimes 100% Pilsner malt, right? and that's it. I mean, it's just basic. But one of the things you had to do here is I think most research papers would leave it at that. And you notice that there's something missing there. We got hops, we got malt, but it doesn't ever talk about the water profile of the beer. And a lot of papers just totally leave that out. But in this instance, you had to look at the water profile of the beer, right?
Yeah. So we actually had an RO system this was done at SIU. So we did have complete filtered beer. Water, not beer.
Right. Yeah, complete filtered water. There you go. Yeah.
It was water. I mean, so it was water. So we did do that. But again, most people are like, in experimental beer, most of us, even in my lab now, I'm using DI water. Mm-hmm. It's completely stripped. Yeah. It's even RNase free.
Yeah.
That's how clean this is. So, and most people are like, I'm just using DI water. Why do I need to report that? Mm-hmm. Well, people need to know, again, like I said, we know that water influences the brewing parameters, but also can influence the flavor, particularly if you go back to historical records. Again, as we kind of mentioned earlier in the segment, water chemistry is going to impact styles like Burton-on-Trent, Czech Pilsners. I mean, we kind of talked about that, but with us, I needed to make sure that my beer or my water, was even across the board. Mm-hmm. So I was adding in, so I knew how much bicarbonates I was adding. That's why we obviously tested our water to see what it was. Right.
And you said you were using RO water, but even your RO water had some residual compounds in it, right? I mean, I think
we had, I think, about 15 milligrams per liter. The reason why it's been drilled into my head is milligrams per liter, because I was actually changing everything from 15 ppm to milligrams per liter. So
that's right. You'll hear those interchangeably, right? Milligrams per liter, ppm. The reason why that's important, I guess, a little short tangent here. I only learned this a couple of weeks ago, but that ppm means parts per million of something, right? So if you don't specify milligrams per liter, it's parts per million of what, right? Parts per million of, it can be anything. And so a lot of people will say ppm, and usually they mean milligrams per liter. But again, it's more accurate to express it as milligrams per liter. And so that's what we'll use on this episode's milligrams per liter, because that's how Katherine explains it in the paper.
Oh, that's what I was changing while I went into labor.
Okay. That was some revisions that you were making on a paper right before you went into labor, which we were talking about.
That paper, yeah.
Oh, interesting. So you went into labor writing, doing revisions for this paper.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't guess that.
I jokingly call it, I go, it's Bubby's paper. And my family, or particularly my husband, he goes, oh, that paper. I'm like,
Well, that's really interesting. So Catherine and I were talking about this off the air, that she went into labor while editing a paper. I didn't realize at the time it was this paper, but so we'll leave this in for the podcast so people can hear this. So she actually went into labor while editing and doing the revisions for this paper to send it in. And that was the revision, changing all the ppms to milligrams per liter. That's fun. Okay, well, not fun. It probably wasn't fun for you, but it's fun for the podcast.
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, it is what it is.
It is what it is. That's exactly right.
It is what it is. I mean, there's been worse things that have happened. I mean, it's just a funny thing.
Exactly. It's funny and it is what it is. So you did need to add bicarbonates to it, right? And as I mentioned before the show, you added the bicarbonates at boil. So I wanted to talk about two things. One is like, what level of bicarbonates did you add? And then why at boil?
Like I said, as we've kind of specified, we needed to add the bicarbonate. Well, we didn't want to add it in the mash. We knew it would impact the not the fermentation. It would impact the mashing. Mm-hmm. And when you're, like you said, as we've kind of talked about, when you're making experimental beer, you have to make sure that the only change that is happening is the variable that you're wanting to change. In our case, that variable was the bicarbonate level. So what we had to do is we had to make sure that we were hitting the same gravity, same color. We were trying to get the same color, which again, all of that, and the same pH.
Yeah, same pH, same color, same IBU, same gravity. You don't want any of these
everything we wanted to be the same. So literally you want the same starting material.
Right.
Because again, so once we had done all of the mashing, that was when we were like, okay, well, we have to make sure that it's properly dissolved and properly incorporated into the wort. So the boil was the only place we could do it.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? You need to make sure that all of the bicarbonate is dissolved into solution, and that makes sense that the boil is a good place to do that. So what were the treatment levels that you did for bicarbonates?
So our control, which we classified, I think, as 0, was really about 15 ppm, but then we added in 50, because I redid the project. So I'm like, wait, how much? So 50, 75, and 100 was what we added. Mm-hmm.
And you added that as baking soda, right? To add the bicarbonate in there.
I mean, that's basically the brewing salt that you're going to get. So
right.
And like I said, I like making, due to my industry experience, I have worked in a brewery for a while. Not as a brewer, I was a lab technician. But I want to try and make all my projects as industry applicable as possible. Mm-hmm, yeah. Because that's, at the end of the day, I love furthering science, but if I'm here to further my industry.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that was the thing, is like, I want this to be like, how is this furthering industry and helping them out? Because we know that, again, we are seeing an increase in Brett beers out there, but maybe someone's in an area that doesn't have ideal water, or the water's harder, particularly here in Florida. We have hard water. Mm-hmm. How is that hard water going to impact Brett versus, again, it behaves differently than sack. So
right. And I mean, it is a little atypical to add bicarbonates to the boil, but the bicarbonate is going to have gone through like the whole process, right? So it's going to have gone through the mash if you're using hard water and things, and there will still be residual bicarbonate in the beer that affects fermentation, which is what makes this a reasonable assumption and a reasonable way to add bicarbonate. Again, trying not to mess up the mash or the sugars, but focus just on bicarbonate and its impact on Brett. So of course you've done the boil, and now it's time to inoculate. So you inoculated with Brett bruxellensis at 1.2 million cells per mil per degree Plato, which is a pretty consistent, industry standard pitch rate. And why Brett bruxellensis? It's the most popular one, I'm guessing, right?
It was the most popular, and it was the one that was generously donated to us.
Awesome. Yeah, perfect. Which is also an aspect of research too. So then tell me about fermentation. How long did you ferment, and at what temperature, and that sort of stuff?
So we actually fermented in a fermentation chamber. I believe.
Yeah. 21 Celsius for 12 weeks. Yeah.
So the reason 12 weeks came into play was we wanted to make sure that it went to completion. Mm-hmm. So we allowed it to ferment all the way through until there was no change in gravity for, I believe, I can't remember if it was 3 days or up to 7 days.
Yeah.
It was a significant amount of time because we wanted to ensure that there was no more, that the fermentation had completely stopped. And the fact that Brett's a slower fermenter, we didn't want to be like calling it quits, so to speak, early and missing out on maybe a potential change that would have happened if we allowed it, if we like I said, stopped it before it had come to completion.
Mm-hmm. And that's where you mentioned in the first segment that you stopped these fermentations when the specific gravity reached 1, right? Or if it did reach 1 at all, right? Because some of these didn't, as we'll see in a few minutes. Yeah.
We saw that there is inhibitory aspects of bicarbonates on Brett, but unlike SAC, which I believe it's about, they don't recommend above 50 or 75 pp or milligrams per liter of bicarbs for Saccharomyces. But above that for SAC, it'll stop fermenting or it'll be where it just doesn't work. While with Brettanomyces, we saw that there's not even an inhibitor. I mean, it's inhibited to an extent, but it still can ferment.
Yeah, which is really fascinating, right? And so again, your levels are a 0, which were zeros in air quotes. Add 15 to all of these numbers because that's the baseline water. But a 0 milligram per liter, a 50, a 75, and a 100 milligrams per liter in bicarbonate. And then again, what you measured is fermentation parameters. You measured gravity reduction, you measured CO2 production, the time that it took to reach the 1.0, which the control strain did, which I think is perfect, right? The one with 0 made it all the way down to 1 and probably would have continued going below 1 if you had let it go. So measuring those fermentation parameters, but then also looking at quality parameters, alcohol production, original and final gravity, calories, density, and then a cool part that we'll spend a lot of time on is the SPME, solid phase micro extraction GCMS analysis to identify and quantitate volatile compounds. But let's start with the fermentation performance. So we've talked about that a little bit. And one really cool takeaway that you just mentioned is that for Saccharomyces, if you're over 50 or 75, whatever that number is, it's going to inhibit fermentation completely. But the Brett at 100 milligrams per liter still fermented, albeit slower.
Yeah. And I mean, jokingly, I had a student who we actually did this experiment. Again, we did at much higher levels.
Okay.
SPME has been done. Data hasn't been analyzed yet, so don't quite have that yet. And we did a modified yeast 14 method to it as well. But the levels that we're looking at and talking about are 0, 100, 250, and 400 milligrams per liter. And it's still fermented.
All right. Interesting.
Unfortunately, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, so then Brett seems to have a higher tolerance to bicarbonates than Saccharomyces, which is kind of what you mentioned in the first half of the show, that increased survivability, right?
Yeah. And that was the thing is I'm hoping to write a little lit review, kind of basically jokingly, Brettanomyces is going to be able to survive. I think there's a paper out there already. It says Brett will survive a wine apocalypse. Brett will survive anything. I mean, it's that hardy. I mean, our research in beer shows that, and I think there's wine research to show the same thing, that, Brett can survive, in wooden barrels, relatively easily. I mean, you can even find Brett, I think research I have found with even, they're found within a millimeter of the wood itself. I mean, they burrow in. That's why once you have Brett within a barrel, unless you don't want that characteristic, you have to get rid of the barrel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense, right? And it's really cool too to think about. So in the control experiment, it fermented, and again, all of these fermented. The control experiment got down, almost close to the terminal gravity at around 20-25 days, but it continued to ferment for the next 50 days. I mean, some of these you had data points all the way through 75 days, and that Brett with the 0 milligrams per liter of bicarbonate is just continuing to chug away, right? Which I think is consistent with what a lot of brewers see when they use Brett. You see it continue to ferment over a long period of time. And while the 100 milligrams per liter sample was slower to ferment, it reached its terminal gravity about 30 days and then it stopped, right? I mean, it was done fermenting at that point, which I think is an interesting observation as well. It fermented not as well as the 0, but it did ferment, but then ultimately it reached sort of a point well above that 1 degree specific gravity where it was done. And so does this sort of takeaway kind of mean, people who are brewing with, or brewers that are brewing with hard water or really high bicarbonate levels, this is having an inhibitory effect on their Saccharomyces fermentations, but also their Brett fermentations?
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, like I said, we've redone the study. However, I don't quite have that fermentation data, just because I wasn't able to collect the data. I was using some digital airlocks, and unfortunately, I didn't set them up the way I thought I had. But we definitely see inhibitory. I don't know at what point we will ultimately see complete inhibition. That was the overall idea, was we were hoping to see inhibition, complete inhibition for Brettanomyces. But we never, I think the levels are going to be well outside of what would be realistic to even use in brewing to see complete inhibitory. But maybe it's a way, if we're trying to look at inhibitory, maybe it can be something that we can manipulate or figure out for cleaning purposes.
Okay.
Maybe there's a barrel we're wanting to preserve, and maybe we just put in a lye solution. But at what concentration does that lye solution or any sort of chemical, food grade chemical, do we need to add to ensure that it stays safe to maintain the barrel, but we're inhibiting the Brett too, because maybe we're trying to balance that microflora within the barrel.
Right. So using some sort of highly alkaline, high bicarbonate solution to neutralize the Brett character out of the barrel for cleaning purposes or something. That's really interesting. No, that's great. That's a really interesting application, and it's really cool. I'm looking forward to that research. Then when it comes out, we'll have to have you back on to see what the ultimate, if you continue down that path where you reach. And there was another interesting fermentation parameter that you looked at here, which was CO2 production, which is kind of a direct measure of when fermentation is active or most active. Yeah. And it was pretty cool to see this because it's kind of all over the place. The 0, not. There are some clear trends, but you did see very clear differentiation between the different treatments in terms of fermentation and how long it carried on. Because with the 0 milligrams per liter Brettanomyces, you saw it kick up fermentation within 3 or 4 days, and then it continued fermenting for 20 or so days, and then continued sort of chugging away at low levels. But especially the 100 milligram per liter treatment took almost 7 or 8 days, almost 9 days before it reached sort of its peak fermentation, and its peak CO2 production was let's say on a scale of 100 it was around 40, whereas the 0 and the 50 milligrams per liter were up at 90 and 60, right, on a scale of 0 to 100. Which is pretty interesting. So that is showing that not only is it inhibiting the ability of the cell to ferment longer, right? It's actually stopping the Brettanomyces from fermenting as vigorously.
Yeah, and that's where, sorry, again, we're seeing that inhibitory aspect of the bicarbonates on the Brett. I think we went 0. Originally, we were doing 0, 50, 75, and 100. So we were noticing that there was starting to be a change in the fermentation kind of after once we did the 75. Because we were plotting as we were going, and I also was doing the, excuse me, I also was analyzing the data as we were going, like the VOCs. So, but yeah, the CO2 production, again, as you said, it was another aspect for us to monitor and to check the vigorousness of the fermentation. Because as a microbiologist, I mean, we could have done what would have been interesting is to actually probably done cells in suspension. Maybe plot that. That would have been an interesting thing to look at cells in suspension, and then maybe look at I'm trying to think of some other microbiological things we could have looked at, which I'm like, no. But
maybe like vitality or something, the ability, plate them and see how much, they're able to grow or whatever in that future thing. But again, I'm not a microbiologist either. But the cool part about this is, again, this is a chemistry, paper. And so this is the way that chemists will look at it. And it's still a good indicator. If CO2 is being produced, then that means fermentation is occurring. So it's a really direct indicator of fermentation activity. So fermentation performance, it sounds like there was a pretty strong inhibitory effect on fermentation performance. But then the other aspect of this is the volatile compounds, right? The aroma and flavor of Brett beer. And there was a really interesting takeaway from this in terms of total volatile compounds. The 50 milligram per liter actually had the highest, although the control was next, right? The control was next. But the 100 milligram per liter had the lowest amount of volatile compounds. So it had the lowest amount of the things that might contribute to Brett character.
I mean, definitely aromatic wise, when you were smelling it, like, so when we were smelling the beer, you could definitely kind of notice that there was some changes going on. Obviously we didn't taste it because I didn't really want to taste beer or this beer and feel like I'm sucking on a bar of soap for my 100 milligram. But we can definitely, like, again, because we've been around, like Eric and I had worked together, are worked together so much, and we do a lot of volatile stuff, that we could definitely smell the difference. So that was kind of a fun thing to just smell and be like, hey, there's definitely some differences here, which was, like I said, fun to see. And that gave me early hope that this paper might be decent.
Yeah, right. And then it was. I mean, and so you're smelling this, and then of course you run it through some actual, analytical analysis. I mean, again, you use GCMS and some headspace extraction in order to quantitate the exact amounts of the different compounds, the different individual isolated compounds, which was really cool. And you saw that esters, interestingly, the 100 milligrams per liter treatment had the highest esters, but that didn't necessarily translate to higher overall, volatile organic compounds in the beer.
I mean, we definitely noticed that the esters overall, and that's what most people, when we think about beer, we're thinking about those flavor compounds or the fruitiness of it, which I will admit was a bit surprising to see that the esters were so high, but also esters are kind of one of, again, some of those stressor compounds that we do see, particularly when we're looking at it. Because if you look, ethyl acetate is produced at one of the highest levels in the 100, milligram per liter. It was close to about 4.35-ish. So we see, and that can also be at such high levels, it can be solvent-like.
Interesting.
So that's the thing, is some of these, the compounds may have shifted from something that's pleasant to something that is just would be a defect because the yeast are so stressed out. Now, if you go look down and you're looking at, again, another big one that we were really wanting to look at, not just esters, is, again, those Brett-associated compounds, like the phenols. When you go down to it, you definitely notice that 50 milligram per liter concentration had the highest level of the Brett-specific compounds that we were interested in, followed by, again, that control group. So I guess for us, our takeaway was you can irritate or upset your yeast a little bit, you're going to develop some of those flavor characteristics that you want and make it a little bit more interesting versus just leaving it and allowing it to kind of be without adding those kind of compound, without kind of adding in the bicarbonates. So there's, I thought it was more complex with the 50 milligram per liter bicarbs, because again, we're seeing a greater disparity or a greater concentration, a greater number of compounds, that's kind of the word I was looking for, because versus some of the others, which may have had compounds they may have had a high concentration, but it was only in specific ones.
Yeah. Right, in specific areas of the volatile compounds. That's a really interesting takeaway, right? A little bit of stress seems to, it'd be interesting to do some sensory analysis on this at some point in the future too. But a little bit of stress at that 50 milligrams per liter level produced a more aromatics, right? And you said there was a little bit more complexity on your own, smelling of the beers, and that's really fascinating. And on the other side of that, those phenols, those 4EP, 4EV, 4VG, 4VP, there were almost no phenols detected in that 100 milligrams per liter treatment, which indicated that bicarbonates had a very strong impact on the so-called, the podcast quotes, Brett character of those phenols, right? I mean, the 100 milligrams per liter really destroyed those phenols that people desire in beer.
Yeah, I mean, we did see, again, the 4EG was detected in the 100 milligram, but again, that ethyl phenol, which kind of provides that balancing act a little bit for the EG, wasn't even detected. And I mean, I promise you, I go through, if I suspect something, I go back through my chromatograms sometimes multiple times just to make sure that I'm reporting exactly what I'm 100% certain on what I'm reporting. But yeah, it was kind of not disappointing, but it was okay, so it does. We are seeing that it does have an impact again, because if you're putting in Brett to your beer, great. Yeah, I do want the esters, but I'm putting it in for Brett. I want that character. I want those compounds produced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You want those. You want barnyard and horse blanket, and then earthy, right? Those are the compounds that you desire. So those high bicarbonate levels, that 100 milligrams per liter, that's really going to impact that Brett character. So I think that's really interesting. It sounds like kind of a big takeaway from this is that some bicarbonate is good for overall aroma and complexity, but too much is too much, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely, because at the end of the day, when you're wanting to produce a beer that's going to be consumed and enjoyed by your customers, and ethanol content also plays a role.
Sure. Yeah.
And I mean, if your fermentation's not coming to completion, like what we saw for the Brett beer, don't remember how different the ethanol concentrations were.
Yeah, no, I don't think I wrote it down in my notes, but I know that they were different. I mean, there were differences in ethanol concentration because, again, that 100 milligram per liter sample didn't attenuate as far as the one with 0 and 50 did. The one with 0 and 50 were really the only ones that actually got down to 1 or would continue to have gone below 1. The 75 and 100 didn't even make it down to the specific gravity of 1. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about, how bicarbonate impacted the not just the fermentation performance, but also the sensorial aspect of Brett beer. And like you mentioned, that ABV is something that would be impacted obviously by fermentation performance.
I don't remember if it was a statistical difference in the ABV. I thought I reported it, but I guess I didn't. But again, if it's too high, then we're not going to see that drop at all. Right. Like I said, we've done small yeast 14 stuff, which those who are not familiar with the yeast 14, it's a modified fermentation where you're looking at fermentation kinetics. It is designed to be completed within, I think, approximately 5 days-ish. I don't know. Do y'all run yeast 14s in your lab?
No. It's first I've heard. No.
I was actually, Andrew was the one who kind of brought me, I guess, to the dark side. To the dark side on this one. It's a very small fermentation. They're great to do quick fermentations. You can do a number of them within a couple of weeks. So I've ran them for this type of project. The thing is that you are inoculating it at a higher rate than what you do industry-wise. So kind of I would not compare the fermentation kinetics from a yeast 14 to this paper, because again, we're talking about 15 milliliter fermentation tubes versus a 10-gallon fermentation. So, but it gives you it allows you this idea of what's going to happen in the fermentation. But the yeast 14s are nice in that, again, I can actually isolate a certain parameter. So in this case, if I want to do preliminary work, I can go, well, how is 400 milligrams per liter going to really impact this fermentation?
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah. And so that's good. That's a proof of concept that then you can scale up and produce papers like this, which again, cool takeaways from this paper that the Brettanomyces definitely, that bicarbonates certainly seem to slow the fermentation of Brettanomyces, and it certainly seemed to impact the fermentation, at least in terms of secondary metabolite production, volatile organic compounds and non-volatile compounds. I mean, the beers were just different with higher bicarbonate levels, especially at the high 75 and 100, and even different from the 0 and 50, right? Even in your own personal experiences. So it's pretty cool research to see that bicarbonate is directly, or maybe that hard water is definitely impacting, Brettanomyces fermentations. So Katherine, if you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be?
I guess the big thing is, you can play with brewing salts. Brewing salts are going to impact Brettanomyces just as they do with Saccharomyces. I think that was kind of the big thing, was start providing information for our brewers on, if they are interested in utilizing Brett, how can they utilize it? And does the same techniques or concentrations of compounds impact Brett the same way they do Sac? And at the moment, at least from from this paper, the changes, they don't behave, they aren't impacted at the same levels.
Right. Saccharomyces cerevisiae seems to be much more heavily impacted by bicarbonates than Brett.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And it certainly sounds like there's future research coming, right? I mean, to hear about, what level is actually finally too much for Brettanomyces. And I'm pretty excited about getting into that. But is there anything else that you wanted to share about today's study that we didn't get to?
No, we actually still have we still have yeast strains in our freezer that we want to do the molecular work on. So if someone wants to do that, I'll send you the strains.
Hey, there you go. Yeah, listeners, if you want to do some molecular work and maybe get in on some of that research, it sounds like Katherine could use some help. So, well, Katherine, thank you again so much for coming to talk to us about Brettanomyces and the impact that water chemistry and specifically bicarbonates have on Brett. So thank you for joining me in the Brew Lab.
Thank you for having me. I had a great time.
Great. Well, I hope to have you back at some time in the future. And listeners, in the show notes, you'll find a link to Katherine's article, which is titled Bicarbonate Inhibition and Its Impact on Brettanomyces brexillensis' Ability to Produce Flavor Compounds, published in the Journal of the American Society of Brewing Chemists in August 2021. And if you enjoy this content, please leave a review wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to check out our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.